And after the new space missions, I will talk about our mission and where we are right now and how we are going forward with this. Thank you for the intro, Conrad. Well, same rules as yesterday. Whenever you have questions, please just interrupt me and you will get more out of it. So that is the menu for today. The theory mainly compared with respect to the old space or the old way of doing space missions. Then a bit of the advantages or the motivation that why we should do it. And finally about our free disarm mission. My part will take, I think, a little more than half an hour, about half an hour. Yeah. Welcome. So, comparison of new space versus old space. Development model. New space is iterative, rapid prototyping, frequent releases. Old space is more sequential, trying to design first, manufacturing, then using, and how can I say, like each of the cycle is, you want to do each of the cycle very carefully and then move to the next cycle. And you think, you assume that you don't need to go back. Sometimes you still need, but yeah, that's the approach. With new space, you want to have short development cycles. An example, a couple of years ago, Planet said that this PlanetScope satellites, this 3.7 meter, what we saw there, the data yesterday, which basically started from a 3-unit CubeSats, was already 11th iteration, what they are launching now. I don't know, by now it's something like 15th iteration, I think. And this also means that it is usually faster to launch, it's more frequent launches, whereas old space, sometimes the mission you're launching in 15 years. I'm not trying to tell that the old space is inherently bad. There are very cool old space missions, like SOHO, for example, this solar remote sensing satellite. But yeah, but old space has come here also for a reason. And with new space, the focus is on getting the cost down. And also with our mission, the free disarm mission, we are working constantly on how to save the cost. And one place where we want to save is the launch. There are ways we can do it. Yeah. Old space is typically more government missions, government procurements who don't tolerate risk. And new space is usually commercial, but don't have to be. Then the risk tolerance. Maybe here, you can all read, I don't read for you, but maybe to underline that failure used to learn. I think this is a key thing. It's like how you approach failure, or how you, what is your attitude towards failure? Is it something you should avoid at any cost, or failing in some less critical thing is actually good? That you can fix it and then you can go on fast. This COTS acronym is known for you, I guess. COTS, commercial off the shelf. So in new space, you want to use as much, let's say, mass-produced electronics as possible, and as little specially designed electronics as possible. I give you one example of S-Cube-1. I was the systems engineer of S-Cube-1. The batteries of S-Cube-1 were laptop batteries. we break a laptop battery pack and we put it to the satellite. We did because we knew actually that this specifically, the only place where we could get these cells, this lithium-ion cells, was in this battery pack, and we knew that this, especially this model, had flight history, and we knew that it had worked already. Any questions about the part so far? Yeah. Yeah.
They had an exhaustive calibration from all the parts of the satellite. We carry this calibration, but what does that fast?
This fast means fast. But functional testing, I mainly understand it that you start from the part that you want to test some function. For example, Planet early days. Scientists were very critical, telling that it's doing just pretty big pictures. But I think that was their purpose. At first, they wanted to just have visually data that you can use it for visual interpretation. And if you wanted to compute NDVI or whatever more complex, so then the levels were all out of the place. And with functional testing is that you first define the use case or a function you want to serve. And then you test that, is it able to perform it? And then you try to cut out like all the unnecessary, nice to have exhaustive tests. And then you start to maybe go more complex tests later on if you want to add functions.
That's why, for example, if someone has an orbit of RGB, ultra very high spatial resolution, and they want to add the near infrared.
Yeah.
So they will launch another fancy satellite just for those bands.
Can be, yeah. But you can also launch a new satellite for these bands with the old space approach. Yeah. Okay. So the one word that starts to ring in my head is lean. That you want to have a lean design. You want to have just the necessary, what is the minimum viable product. Yeah, go ahead. Mm-hmm. It is. Yeah, yeah. That's very valid point. And actually, the new space has brought the space debris problem closer, and this is one of the drawbacks it had. But there is already a law has passed in US and also in Europe that the new missions that are launched should be deorbited in 5 years after the end of lifetime. And this is a responsibility you gotta do. And for example, for the Freedesar mission, that's going to be launched quite high in 690 kilometers. The air drag is quite small. We have to save quite large amount of fuel for the deorbiting. So,
but what happens, for example, with the loss communication? Then it's like that is zero.
Yeah, there are risks for sure. But one good thing for the new space wings actually is that if you launch the new space wings somewhere like 500 kilometers and lower, then the air drag is your friend actually. If you launch your new space wings to relatively low orbits, then 500 kilometers is such altitude that already the air drag in few years is already doing the job for you. So until you keep your new space stuff to these altitudes, then I'm not too worried. But if you're launching big amounts of satellites to high orbits, then it's a big risk. But the beauty of our free disarm mission is to 690 kilometers, that is just 3 satellites. Whereas Planet has 170 satellites. But the coverage is actually about quite similar, the differences in the SWAT video. Valid point, yes, new space is stressing the space debris. Worry. More questions? No. Commercial contracts, government procurement. One of my friends, I hope you, Connor, you don't take it personally, or any other ESA people who is here in the room is not taking it personally, but he's saying that ESA in the words is very new space, but in actions is very old space. So I don't know how you comment this. You're rather young and new in ESA.
Well, I do agree it's very old space in the majority of the world.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of pushing stuff to development or implementation, it take a while to do that, especially in the missions. But as Jean-Paul, Jean-Pascal was saying, we're trying to reduce that time to development with the Scout missions, for example. So we're trying in some sense, but as for the most part, yes.
And obviously, ESA is composed of such a big amount of people, and like each have their own mindsets, and also to change such a big organization like ESA is not something like. And the old guys are doing the things in the old way because they say it has been always done like this, and it has worked, and this is right. But it doesn't mean that you cannot do things differently. Yeah. Sure. Some reminders. I'm not going to these meetings now. Definitely the difference is this frequent crashes. And also the lifetimes, the design lifetimes. I think, do I have it in some other way? No. The lifetimes. Typically new space lifetimes, new space missions lifetimes are not very long. I don't know, can somebody give an example of a new space mission with a lifetime of more than 15 years? Can I ask ChatGPT? Can you give example of a new space mission with lifetime more than 15 years? Typically, the new space missions are 3, 4, 5 years, maybe sometimes 7. Old space missions, they 10 plus, 12, and sometimes they end up actually, there are really cool missions also in old space. Like sometimes these missions end up living more than 20 years. You can Google about, I think it was Landsat 7 or Landsat 5. Landsat 5, I think, lived some. MODIS also, yes. Yes, but also the radar missions. RadarSat 2 is still doing well. Also, TerraSat X is still doing well. 18 years in orbit. 7 plus 5. I think it was fuel it had for 12, but this 7 was kind of like, I think it was actually a legal construction at this point, personal impression, that they don't want to guarantee longer like that. They don't want to take responsibility that it lives longer than 7 years. But actually, I think if everything goes well and the fuel also goes well, there is no solar cycle extremes, then I wouldn't be surprised if 1A keeps ticking 15 plus years. Yeah, and for most of the applications, it's still doing well.
But is there some kind of observed degradation?
Paris, yeah, they reported a year ago. I haven't listened. Connor, maybe you can add something about the Sentinel-1A problems. I heard they were reporting about phase accuracy problems. For our applications, if you look at the coherence for the agriculture use, it was not a problem. We did some experiments. It was still doing fine after ESA reported that there is some degradation. But maybe for the PSIMs or the permanent scatter or persistent scatter stuff, it's an issue.
No, I'm not having sure in terms of the results and the errors we're sensing.
Yeah. Okay. Any more questions about the old space versus new space? Is it somehow clear? Actually, if you try to Google for this new space, then I couldn't find any rigorous definition. I didn't find any Wikipedia article about it. It's a kind of a vague term. And sometimes maybe it is a bit overhyped. And it's kind of, both old space and new space have their virtues. But I would say that new space has came here also for a reason. And it has its place. Yeah, this I already said, that it has always been done like this doesn't mean that other ways are not possible. And in the other areas, like old farts, sorry for the term, when I was teaching signals and systems, signal processing in University of Tartu for a couple of years. And then we had a lecture about the 3G, 4G telecom networks. One relatively young guy from Ericsson came to give a lecture and told that when they did these experiments in the early 2000s and set it up, then the opposition from the old telecom school was kind of like enormous skepticism. This is not going to work. All these concepts, it's going to be too power hungry. It's going to have this. It's going to have that. You're never going to have this megabits or gigabits. And yeah, sometimes like when some old pessimist is too loud, they are often wrong. Actually. And the same about the deep learning neural networks. I was talking myself with a mathematician, very bright guy, very bright old school guy. And he was telling me that it's too complex to work, too many degrees of freedom. Yeah. Finally, the experiment is the test of truth. To me, it seems that the main difference is accepting the risk in new space. Is that you agree that it's okay to sometimes fail, and there is even I've heard such quotes that if you fail too little, then you have over designed, you have over engineered, and then like you should fail a bit, then you haven't, let's say, invested too much into it. I like the concept. I think I said it yesterday also. I like the concept of failing forward. That you fail with something, you correct, you learn, you correct, and you move forward faster. And it's often faster way than trying to model everything and foresee everything, because it's really hard to foresee and model everything. Whatever practical thing you do, for example, the same mowing detection where we went from the 20 test fields to countrywide, like you've got to do the test and the experiment in a big scale. Then you learn and find out the problems, but you can correct them. And then I would like to end with this social science questions, that how to overcome the fear of failure and how to be more friendly, but at the same time demanding to each other. What do you think? What would you do to achieve? Yeah, that is correct. You want to do the failures in a not very expensive way, that you don't want to fail the whole mission at once without any insurance. True, Tainis.
Maybe it's not going to get down to this question. So it's more like the first biggest.
Yeah.
Here is like new space and monster connections and all sorts. I wanted to just ask you comment like your research, because the research mission is not one purely like independent mission, because you should rely on Sentinel-1 and it's like a cannon launch with a mission for reason. Yeah, correct.
Actually, formally we can. Formally we can. We are actually not doing it in that way. We will talk with, we are talking with ESA, we are talking with European Commission. But actually, formally, if you look at the space law, the only thing we have to guarantee is that we don't collide with other satellites. That's the only thing. But we don't need any two-way communication. We just fly there and listen to the signal.
Okay.
Yeah. But in reality, of course, we collaborate and we talk with ESA, we talk with Commission, and also Serco is our partner. And Serco is also responsible for Sentinel-1 operations and maneuvers. And Serco helps to do the maneuvers for our mission.
Because I was mentioning this in context of this long space, because these are the things like, space piloting, we just simply to minimize risks and just not to allow any some kind of close.
No, yeah, 100 kilometers is not that close. But
okay.
Yeah, we are not coming to the few meters distance. Yeah. Sure. Any more questions, ideas about this? All right. Then first, now let's go to this our free disarm mission that we briefly mentioned. I think I would spend 10 minutes more. 10 minutes, okay. Yeah, 9:35. And yeah, Sentinel-1 is the most powerful SAR data source. I think you know, most of you know here, because you are insiders of Earth observation. And the idea is to augment Sentinel-1 with free formation flying receiver sets. Why free? Actually, 2 is minimum, but we think 3 is more sensible. And when you receive the signal at different angles, then you can make the data 3D. And the concept itself is not new. We have not invented it. There was SRTM mission who did single pass across track SAR interferometry. There was, and still is, the TandemX mission which is doing it. But the problem is that this data has not been available in large scale. The duty cycle and SWAT visit of TandemX is relatively narrow. And with a fraction of cost, we can kind of double the value. Of course, doubling the value is a marketing term, but if you have about the same area, if you have the height dimension or you don't have it, then I think most of you agree that you would like to have the height dimension also. What do you think? How much this main mission costs? One satellite with manufacturing drones. More. Can somebody get the order of magnitude right? One satellite is a little more than 200 million. Yeah. 200 million, and our mission, these 3 small satellites in company, we want to do it in 40 million. So it's 20% of the cost. So kind of makes sense. You spend a little extra and you have a way more value. Then why we do it? What's the main motivation? And actually the main motivation is forest monitoring. Now I'm really happy that yesterday when I heard the introduction round, that I heard that, I don't know, maybe not half, but 1/3 of you are doing some forest application. And the end user applications, what we are thinking of, you can of course do many other things also, is the stem volume estimate and the carbon stock estimate, which are related. And the main advantage comes from physically measuring the height. At the forest parcel level, we know from the experiments with TandemX data that we can get that forest parcel level about 10% accuracy, 1 to 3 meter error. If your forest is 25 meters, your height error is 3 meters. Not so bad. You can estimate the volume quite well. Yeah. And for sure, there are more accurate methods for measuring forest, like LiDAR, like going in situ. But this same accuracy, this about 90% accuracy in measuring the height, and same accuracy at global at the same time, nothing like this exists. And I am pushing forward, and we are developing this mission until somebody proves that there is a better technology which is better in the combination of accuracy, global coverage, and reasonable cost. I don't know any better technological means so far. Some people come to us and say that why AI is so powerful, why you don't just model it with AI? You can do it with AI, but the problem is that when your input data currently is, let's say here is some, say this is stem volume. Then here is some kind of satellite, let's say some reflectance. That's some band. It can also be some radar backscatter, that doesn't matter. But the relation is something like that. And then you give an AI that now develop me the relation, develop me the model here. Of course, you can do a linear model with AI, you can try to fit the model in the best possible way. But if your data is so scattered, it's all over the place, and the parameter that you are measuring is not directly proportional to the physical parameter you want to estimate, then you end up with 60% accuracy. And the main advantage of why we do this mission is that this scatter plot, when we do this volume coherence, for example, also the phase methods, will be so much more narrow, and it's so much closer to the one-to-one fit. Close to physically measuring the height. Here is the animation of the mission. Sentinel-1 is the signal source. For safety reasons, we fly ahead. Actually, ahead is safer. Those who want to know, dive into orbital mechanics. The reason actually is that when you lose propulsion, then you start to lose the speed, and when you lose the speed, your orbital period becomes shorter and not longer. And if your orbital period is shorter, then you drag away and you move away from the range. Yeah. Yeah.
It's the same orbit, or it's like
with the very same orbital period, about 100 kilometers ahead. One of them could even be in the very same orbit, the same circular orbit like Sentinel-1, 100 kilometers ahead. And with other two, we are playing with this eccentricity of the orbit, you know, the elliptical, slightly elliptical shapes. And the other, and I have forgotten the parameters. There are these runs and downs, and like how the phasing and the shape of the orbit. The idea is that you want to make sure that over 3 satellites, they never collide, that always they keep close by, and then you form some kind of like relatively, some kind of like hollow orbit. They move around each other. Here is the concept from our phase 0 study that we completed with ESTEC. Actually, paying credit to ESA, thank you, with ESTEC, and especially Mark Zimmermans from ESTEC office, who is a SAR engineer and helped to do the phase 0 study for us. Here is some more data about the concept. It seems that I'm running out of time.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Space scale.
Yeah.
100 kilometers is still like same distance, for example. What would be considered like maybe quite dangerous?
What is dangerous distance? That's a good question. I think we should find some space debris expert, the maneuvers expert for this. I don't know.
Are there missions, similar missions, for example, TanDEM-X?
TanDEM-X is a few hundred meters typically, 300, 400. And also with this receiver, that we want to play with similar distances. 200, 300, 400, few hundred, up to kilometer, maybe 1.5 kilometers. But I don't know, but my gut feeling is that it depends on many parameters of how maneuverable your sati is, which angle you approach, and what are the relative speeds of the two objects that are maneuvering close by. Yeah. Yeah, please. If they are doing super similar thing, that's a very good question. And we are actually at the moment, the software team is playing a lot with TanDEM-X data. We have gigabytes and soon I think terabytes of TanDEM-X data processing through. The only difference with TanDEM-X is that TanDEM-X data is beautiful, and actually I think it's terribly undervalued. Many people don't know how much you can do with it, especially in the boreal and temperate forest. Data volume is the difference. The amount of what TanDEM-X data is producing per orbit is like this, and the areas what with this mission we can cover is like more than 100 times. Let's say if a client comes to us currently in Capaceta, we would like to have a countrywide forest monitoring now here. Can you do it for us with TanDEM-X? Then we have to say, sorry, we can do this little pilot here in this county, but countrywide monitoring we cannot do. And that's the main motivation to do this mission, to have this TanDEM-X-like data in really large-scale, systematic way. And this, we don't see it as a one-off experiment. We want to make it a data factory that year-to-year systematic acquisition, similar to Sentinel-1 itself. Thank you. Actually, my time is already up, but what you say? Keep going. But tell me when it's too bad. Yeah. Here is the preliminary design. Thanks to Erik Kulu and Martin Jussi. Martin is leading the team. Now also Sergei Kushmin. Yeah. These are actually copies from the phase 0 presentation from ESPEC from January. And one of those who are more interested in the technical details actually, then one of the things we are fighting here is the ambiguities of the SAR signal. And what is the thing? So the footprint on the ground, let's say a SAR is flying this way. This is a top view. And this is the azimuth direction. And here is the antenna, and it's putting its beam to the side. Then what is the shape of the beam of the antenna on the ground, if you look top down? And apparently, it is something like a bit like lens shape. Then the antenna itself is like this, like a plate. Some Sentinel-1 antenna is like, let's say, the narrower edge is flying ahead. Then the shape on the ground is like this lens shape. It is in this dimension, it's about 80 to 90 kilometers, depending on the zoom swell. And this dimension was roughly 7 kilometers. You can check on the data. The bursts, which are 200 antenna sweeping, are about 15 kilometers, but I think the native footprint on the ground is about 7 kilometers. And now, what is the thing? Sentinel-1 main antenna is 12 meters long. It's a B1. And we wouldn't like to launch this 12 meter. And now, when we launch a smaller antenna, and in antenna theory, basically the smaller is your antenna, the bigger is your footprint. So our antenna footprint is bigger. And now what happens is that we start to pick up the side lobes of the main antenna. There are methods to overcome it, and I will not go into this. In this, we are working with Theotel to solve it. Here are the launch configurations. Here are some examples of like how to do it in the cheapest, easiest possible way. That if you do non-foldable, basically in the cargo bay, we are talking about 2 meter by 80 meter antenna, receiver antenna, then it could fit there in the cargo bay of the launch vehicle also without folding. Maybe there is a familiar name yesterday, ESA Aerospace. We are hoping for the European new space launchers to be ready, and we would like to launch with European launcher. If that is not possible, then we would launch with Firefly Alpha, a US mission. And this is the timeline. It's slightly outdated. Now we think it's more realistic to launch in the early 2029. But this is how it is going through. And it's, you see a waterfall here, huh? Compensate triangle space. This is, but inside here, the approach is iterative. This is our current consortium. Do we have anybody in the course from Lithuania? No. We have a ESA training course in Riga and nobody from Lithuania. That's why I'm asking is that nanoavionics is the partner of the satellite bus. That is the, let's say, the satellite frame. We are not reinventing the, let's say, the satellite bases. The payload will be custom design and communications also, but the satellite itself is not a new invention. And this is the long-term vision. We want to launch also the companion for ROSEL, for Sentinel-1 next generation. L-band has its advantages. Also ROSEL and Sentinel-1 next generation have better spatial resolution from 20 by 5 to 7 by 7 and 5 by 5 meter. But that is all. Thank you. Any more questions? No. Then thank you. Yeah, Tainis. Downlink.
What's your plans about
Expand downlink, and we are talking with the ground station networks.
it's basically as a service.
It is as a service, yes. You make agreements with the ground station service providers. There is one of them is Kongsberg, is Norwegians, and the others I have to ask our technical team.
Basically, nowadays it's already solved. You don't need to build anything. Just like one of.
Yeah, that is not a big innovation. For the second generation and third generation, we are looking at laser communications. But with first generation, it's most likely going to be expand downlink. Yeah, always.
I'm curious, like, have you started the building process, like with the physical satellites, or like some later?
It will be a bit later, physically building the satellites. Currently, we are talking with the lead investor trying to close the 5 million round. And with this 5 million, we want to get to the design freeze that ESA or some other, let's say, good big space company puts a stamp on it and says, this is going to work, you can manufacture. That's the plan. But about what we are actually physically doing, and one very cool thing what we are doing and what the technical team is doing currently is receiving Sentinel-1 signal. Is when it flies over, then actually you can test large part of the electronics without launching anything. You don't need to launch anything, and you can test a very big part of your systems. The only thing what is the difference is the path losses. instead of like, there is Sentinel-1 sending the signal 690 kilometers, and now bouncing back, you measure it, the reflectance. But instead, we put our receiver electronics close to the ground, and we listen. We know the OIR fly times, we know when it's flying over, we know the bandwidths, we know the frequencies. We have already received the signal multiple times. And we were thinking of doing a LinkedIn post about it. And then we decided to cancel it because we thought it's too sensitive information. And maybe ESA doesn't like it. And our engineer, Indrek Sünter, was deeply angry that why he's not allowed to post it. So interesting. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Okay, so next up we have Jean-Pascal Lejean. So if you would like to introduce yourself and take it away.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me properly? Yes, I can. So I've prepared a few slides. Give me 1 second to go into presenter mode. Is it? Can you see the slides on your end?
Yeah, they're clear.
Okay. Okay. Again, good morning, everyone. So as I said, my name is Jean-Pascal Lejean. I'm the Scout project manager, and I will be talking about Scout missions, which are inspired by New Space. Give me 1 second. Yeah. Okay. So what are Scouts? A few words about the Scout framework, which is a new category of research missions in the Earth Observation Directorate in ESA. It was introduced in 2019, and that's inspired by New Space. And a few, let's say, drivers for this framework is that, first of all, Scout missions are science-driven. So the intention is to prove new disruptive concepts and to timely deliver innovative science. So these are the keywords. Scout missions are not in orbit demonstrator, and they are not commercially driven, though we welcome commercial applications, and I will say a few words about that. And in terms of programmatic constraints, we go for a short turnaround, 3 years, and a small budget, which is 35 million euros, economic condition 2024 for the implementation phase. So phase B, C, D, E1. In terms of organization, in a way, ESA pulls the science innovation, and for this we use our many years of expertise. So we identify technologies which can be further matured for science, and we bring our technical expertise on key technological areas as needed during the implementation, and we also accept a higher level of risks as part of a New Space paradigm. We on industrial side, I mean, we use the New Space paradigm from industry to implement the mission. And for instance, that goes, as was already said by the previous presenter, we rely a lot on commercial off-the-shelf components or units, and we rely a lot on an industrial know-how and processes. There are 2 key steps from a programmatic point of view, which I will detail in the next 2 slides. First is a bottom-up approach, which is to define the mission concept, and this is managed through a consolidation phase. And once we have consolidated the mission, then we go for a top-down approach, which is to deliver the innovative science as a service. So service also is a keyword, and that's through the implementation phase. So in a nutshell, the Scout framework basically is a quick, innovative science plus New Space approach. So what is the consolidation phase? So the objectives of the consolidation phase is to identify new potential Scout candidate missions, and this is ongoing as we speak with 4 potential candidate missions. We want to prepare each candidate mission for implementation within cost and schedule, and the constraints are quite high. I mean, to fit within 3 years for implementation and 35 million euros mean to be really ready, and that's the scope of the consolidation phase, to ensure the quality, credibility, and preparation of the candidate missions. The way we consolidate is to have a consolidated mission concept with a baseline system architecture, which we can assess and which we want to make sure makes sense. We consolidate the mission requirements and we perform a preliminary flow down to system requirements. So this is to demonstrate that the system actually, which will deliver the science, which will deliver the mission requirements, so the system is feasible. So that's an important step from the mission, which will be the science service, towards the system which deliver this service. To this end, we consolidate an end-to-end mission performance simulator to simulate the performances of the mission. We support the ad hoc developments of critical technologies and to make sure we have at least TRL 4 at kickoff of implementation phase. And of course, we consolidate the overall development approach to make sure it fits within the programmatic boundary conditions, which I've just mentioned. So 3 years and 35 million euros for implementation. Each consolidation phase comes with a budget of 700 kilo euros and lasts 9 months. Out of these this consolidation phase, so the 4 missions, we will down select 2 new missions which will be proposed for implementation, and that's done by an independent scientific assessment where we will rank, let's say, the scientific value of each candidate mission, and there will be an independent programmatic assessment in parallel to ensure missions can fit within the programmatic boundary conditions. Now, the implementation phase, which is the one I'm dealing with, essentially, again, I think now you've clearly understood the boundary conditions. I will just not repeat. The way we operate during the implementation phase, so with my team and with industries, we give industry a more proactive role, and that's implemented by means of a service contract with industry, with limited oversight from ESA. So we deviate from, let's say, the more traditional approaches for other ESA mission. It's a fully funded end-to-end service contract. So the contractor basically does everything. So the contractor procures, develops, validates, launches, operates, and completes the entire system, which includes all segments, so ground segment, space segment, and launch services and operations. And the contractor is also in charge of delivering science data as a service to the scientific community. On ESA side, to keep some control of, let's say, the development and make sure we stay within the boundary conditions of 3 years and budget, we have implemented key performance gate reviews, which are go-no-go reviews, if you want, to ensure the project is progressing as per expectations toward the delivery of the service. And then these key performance gate reviews can be connected to any specific element. I mean, can also be the traditional reviews, SRR, PDR, CDRs. It really depends on each project. What is the service? So the service is to deliver innovative science products up to level 2, which are specified in the mission requirements document, which is proposed by industry. So that's the novelty here. And it's countersigned by ESA and the Science Advisory Group at kickoff. And that's to make sure on ESA side, we are happy with what is proposed. And we go along with industry, for instance, as well in terms of risks. So it's a way to, let's say, to be all together in the implementation phase. And we apply the standard free and open data policy for the service. We go for a very lean approach as per the New Space approach. So we have a very lean ESA project team. Basically, it's a team of 2, myself as project manager and a system manager with a limited team of technical experts focusing on critical areas where we believe on either side the competence or the knowledge or the experience is not available in industry. So keywords, I mean, very flexible, solution-oriented mindset. That's to adapt to actual progress, to make sure we don't stick, let's say, to milestones, but we make sure the ultimate goal, which is to launch within 3 years, is managed. And we foster cooperation and transparency with industry, which I like to call the same boat approach. We go for lean reviews. So we don't have the standard ESA category 1 or category 2 reviews involving independent reviewers. We go for project level reviews only. That's the only way to go very quickly and very lean. We go as well for a lean documentation, so that's solely driven by industrial needs. So basically, we don't ask any additional document which is not necessary, not useful for industry. And we go for lean standards. So we start when we issue the ITT for the implementation phase, we propose a tailoring, a deep, thorough tailoring of ECSS standards to fit within the SCART framework and to reflect the new space approach. And we invite industry to further tailor what we propose and using their proven industrial expertise and know-how. And that's a way to align expectations at the very beginning and to avoid, let's say, unnecessary formalism during the execution of the work. There are, though SCART missions are not driven by commercialization, there are opportunities for commercialization, and scaling up is one aspect. It's easy to add recurring satellites to a SCART mission because it's low cost. That would not be paid by ESA. That's, for instance, to replace satellites nearing end of life or to improve the science return once the concept is demonstrated, which, for instance, would result in an improved coverage or a reduced revisit time. That's also to expand science products to commercial applications and to support, for instance, the green transition or sustainability requirements. So that's easy to scale up SCART missions to commercial applications. And commercial applications are relevant to address commercial needs, which can be built on the service delivered by a SCART mission. And here, an incremental approach with a minimum viable product, which was also mentioned by the previous speaker, is very suitable. We would start with a basic commercial service, which would be directly derived from, let's say, the science products. And we would add recurring satellites to expand the commercial service or even more as the service grows. This is a way to minimize financial risks. Now, a few words about the SCART family as it stands today. So the first SCART mission is called HydroGNSS. It's the prime contractor is SSTL in the UK. It's related to the Earth water cycle, and it uses as innovation technology GNSS reflectometry, using also new signals which have never been acquired before. I will not go into too many details. The launch is very soon. It should be the second half of November. So we are super excited and getting ready to get this first SCART mission in orbit. The second one is called NanoMaxSat. It's a constellation of 3 CubeSats, 16 new CubeSats. It's looking at the magnetic field and the ionosphere. It was kicked off in October last year, and the launch will be 3 years afterwards, so Q4 2027. And the last one, sorry, it was a bit too quick, is Tango, which was so Tango is under the leadership of EasySpace in the Netherlands. It will look into pollutants emitted by large industrial sites, and the launch is planned in Q3 2028. So you have a glance of the 3 current SCART missions under implementation, and one being launched very soon, and the others post SRR, addressing specific needs and bringing science innovation. I mean, NanoMaxSat, for instance, will help manage, will help ensure, let's say, the excellence from Europe about monitoring of a magnetic field, which is very important. And EasySpace with Tango will support the Paris Agreement. We also get ready to welcome more SCART missions. So we have started the second SCART cycle, and we are in the process of what I shown before, the consolidation phases. We have 4 new mission candidates, IBDIS, NIAD, Sirius, and SOVAES. All of these are being consolidated. We expect to complete the consolidation studies in January next year. So, I mean, it's 9 months, as I said. Then there will be the assessment, scientific assessment and ranking, leading to a selection of up to 2 new SCART missions out of these 4 in May, June 26. We then will go for the proposal preparation, which would lead to an implementation phase kickoff in January 27 and a final acceptance review in 2030, 3 years after kickoff. So these, out of these 4, we will have 2 new Scout missions. Now, I would like to share with you where we stand with HydrogenSS, as it's the first mission. So we just in a nutshell, we've been through a very intense environmental test campaign over the past 6 months, and that was also linked to the need to change launcher because of the let's say Vega-C failure and the non-availability of reliable European micro launchers. So you can see the steps for each of the 2 satellites of the HydrogenSS constellation. I will not go through this. It's just to show you how intense it was and how actually the new space approach and the fact that we rely on industry helps a lot meet the let's say the deadlines. Few good memories I'd like to share with you. You see on the top left corner the 2 satellites ready for shipment, and the ESA team super happy to see the 2 satellites getting ready and the shipment, the starting of the shipment. And as I speak, I know the 2 satellites have arrived at their final destination in California for the next step, which will be the integration on the Falcon 9 Transporter 15 launcher. So we completed the environmental test campaign for both satellites. That was already in June. We had a successful final acceptance review in July. We shipped, as I said, that's the launch slot as we speak. I don't have a firm date, but that's the time slot when we will be launched on the Falcon 9 Transport 15 rocket. The commissioning is planned 6 months after launch, so I can only wish good luck to HydrogenSS. Of course, we are getting super excited, and it's quite intense time now to make this happen. To conclude, Scout framework, as I said, it's a way to blend a new space with the ESA Earth observation science mission expertise, giving more proactive role to industry with a limited oversight from ESA and a very lean approach as well. It's a quick turnaround. We're talking about 3 years to deliver valuable and innovative science as a service with a small budget and 35 million euros for implementation. It also offers key opportunities for industry in Europe, including commercialization. For instance, HydrogenSS could be used to sell services for agriculture related to irrigation or water management, for instance. These commercial applications can be incrementally derived from the science products at a low cost. And risks are minimized also because the initial development is fully funded and supported by ESA experts, which allows to maximize return on investments. And the Scout family expands very quickly. We have a first mission to be launched very soon, November, as I said. We have 2 other missions being implemented, NanoMaxSat and Tango, both on track. And we will get 2 more joining the family next year. You can find more details on the link I've attached, and this concludes my presentation. Thanks for your attention.